All right, everybody. So welcome. I think I always say this. I know most people, but I don't know everybody. So I'm Luis Betancourt. I'm the director here at the Institute. And today it's my pleasure to introduce the talk, Lydia Wileden, who is a postdoctoral fellow in our program here, also working with Emily Talent. And she has one of the best backgrounds. So she has an undergraduate in urban studies from Columbia University, and a PhD in public policy and sociology from University of Michigan. I was fascinated when we first started to get to know each other and her interviews and so on, because she's really addressing an issue that's been there for a long time, but in some ways needs to be redressed and looked at. So you know that when we think about neighborhoods in particular, so a lot of us work on neighborhoods, we kind of really objectify neighborhoods, right? We talk about poor neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods, neighborhoods that have a lot of eggheads like Hyde Park, neighborhoods that are racial and one or another. And we know that's wrong, right? We wouldn't do that to people. I think we know better now, but we still do that to neighborhoods in parts of the city. And so a lot of Lydia's work is really to understand how people perceive neighborhoods, both where they live and in cases in other places. And what does that knowledge carry? First, how do you even assess it? And what does that knowledge carry? Whether it carries positive messages, hope, transformation, stigma, and other things. So she'll tell you a lot more about it. But this really touches a lot of classical problems of how people perceive the city and in some sense form ideas and act accordingly. But also how we can imagine, futures that are less stuck in these objectifications, and that's playing more into sort of the diversity and possibility of cities. So that's what I see in a lot of your work. So hopefully I find it very inspiring. So Lydia, please welcome again and
Awesome. Thank you, and thanks all for coming. A little bit of a head cold, so I'm going to be a little less extemporaneous than I normally would be, a little more reliant on scripts so that I don't totally go off on a tangent. Thank you, Luis, for that introduction, and to Amy, Elaine, and Heidi for helping me to facilitate this talk. As Luis said, I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the Mansueto Institute and in the Social Sciences Division. And I'm really excited today to have this opportunity to introduce myself and my research agenda to you all. What I'm going to do today is try to give you something of an overview of part of my research agenda that draws on work that I completed for my dissertation and on some ongoing projects. And I'm just collectively calling that work today, Making Sense of a Sense of Place, examining the collective and relational nature of neighborhood knowledge. And before I start, I want to acknowledge that this talk is in some ways fitting that it falls in the midst of a series that Mansueto is doing this spring on urban cognition. As I hope you'll hear, the main through line of my research seeks to capture in realistic ways how people think about neighborhoods. And so I come at this from the perspective of a sociologist, meaning that the way I use concepts like cognition and perception is a lot less technical than the way that psychologists use those terms. But at the end of the day, I think my interests are really similar to those other researchers who are examining how people make decisions in complex environments. And so basically, I'm just really excited to think about how my work can be in conversation with those other researchers and to especially think sort of cross-disciplinary lines about this idea of urban cognition. So to set the stage for my talk today, I want to first offer just an overview of my research agenda. As I mentioned, the main through line of my research is an effort to develop realistic measures of the ways that people think about neighborhoods. My work really grows out of this idea that the way that we see and experience the world around us and the way that researchers, and especially demographers, have measured place are at odds with each other. Right, so within social science and policy making, there is a persistent and even a growing propensity to try to quantify communities and then draw connections, like Luis was saying, between these objective measures of neighborhoods and individual or collective outcomes. But what I think is missing from this research agenda is, from this research, is the recognition that people and their understandings of environments are really highly subjective. When the typical Chicagoan thinks about the Loop, for example, They don't have an omniscient clarity about what that place is like, right? They don't know its demographic makeup, its crime rate, its average rent. But we have a lot of theories that say that people are making decisions based on those actual measures of place. In reality, the knowledge that we use to navigate social environments is imperfect. It hazily reflects and distorts and refracts partial truths about places. So you're probably wondering why I've had this picture up for so long. I like to use this image of the reflection of downtown off of Lake Michigan as a metaphor to illustrate the ways that traditional data capture neighborhoods with this hyper clarity versus really the hazier ways that we actually think about place. In my work, rather than think about this distortion in people's understandings of neighborhoods as noise, what I want to argue is that these subjective or hazy understandings of place really hold important information about neighborhood processes. And so figuring out how we might measure how people think about neighborhoods, both their perceptions of place and how they organize that information in their heads, is really important if we want to understand individual behavior and then broader neighborhood dynamics. So in my work, I typically think about this haziness in two ways. One branch of my research focuses on measuring the information gap between people's subjective knowledge of place and these objective measures. And the other branch focuses more on trying to understand the structure of resident knowledge, the ways that people use comparison and heuristics and reputation to understand neighborhoods in relation to one another. So you can think of that first area of my research as trying to measure what we know about neighborhoods, whereas the second area is really more focused on whether or how we know about neighborhoods. And in both cases, what I'm really interested in is the consequences of these gaps in knowledge. So going back to the idea of urban cognition, what I'm interested in is how gaps in whether and what we know about places might shape our decision making, which then has sort of downstream effects into how neighborhoods change over time. So just to add a little bit more specificity to some of the things that I've been working on, my work measuring what people know about neighborhoods includes a paper examining the gap between perceived and measured racial composition, and another paper that looks at change in crime over time and residents' shifting perceptions of safety. But I'm not going to talk about those today. Instead, I'm going to really focus more on the second way that I'm working on neighborhood perceptions and how people think about neighborhoods, and specifically the relational or the collective dimensions of neighborhood knowledge. So some projects that I have underway that I'm going to talk about today try to touch on how we might measure neighborhood familiarity, and then also trying to develop what are known as ecometric measures of place, specifically around reputation. All right, so just a quick orientation to what I'm going to share over the next 30 minutes or so. I'm going to first take a step back and try to consider why we might want to study neighborhoods in a relational way and what a lot of existing research, sociological research on neighborhood preferences doesn't yet do. And then I'm going to talk about the survey design work that I've been working on to try to address these issues. And then I'll touch on two different research studies that use this data. Okay, so why should we think about neighborhoods relationally? So to ground this idea, I'm going to go back to the 1900s and draw on Cooley's concept of the looking glass self. So this is an idea within social psychology that the process of identity formation, the ways in which we create our own identity, actually isn't so much of our own making, but draws heavily on interpersonal interactions or how one perceives that others think of them. So basically, my identity is not of my own creation, but rather is formed in reference to others. To Cooley, the way that people make sense of themselves is really through comparison. And so while this idea of identity formation through comparison has been central to the study of social psychology, it has very rarely been extended to neighborhoods. There are, of course, a couple of exceptions to this. For example, Suttles in his work on neighborhood identity and mental schemas tried to emphasize the comparative nature of neighborhood identity and argued that places gain their identity through what he called contradistinction. So he wrote, neighborhoods are embedded in a contrastive structure in which each neighborhood is known primarily as a counterpart of some others. And importantly, Suttles was theorizing this idea that place identity is a collective social product rooted in comparison that's drawing on the knowledge not only of people who live in a neighborhood, but also people outside of that neighborhood and what they think. And then 4 decades later, Rob Sampson similarly articulated this idea of collective neighborhood identity in his study of Chicago. In his book, Great American City, Sampson coined the term looking glass neighborhood, clearly drawing on Cooley, to explain how shared and durable perceptions of neighborhoods arise from social interaction, from bias, and from cultural contexts. So his work really suggests that place identity, and especially stigma, grows out of a shared and competing understanding of place. So all of this is to say, the idea that neighborhood identity is relational has been touched upon, but really very little research actually takes up this idea of the relational nature of neighborhoods and tries to measure neighborhood perceptions vis-a-vis one another. So why is that true? I think that the reason that research hasn't delved more deeply into this relational nature is largely due to a lack of data. Scholarship in urban sociology, as Luis was talking about before, has really tended towards this individualistic and variables-oriented paradigm. So we have this large literature on neighborhood effects and many fewer studies that are looking at how people assimilate information about place. So we have a lot of ideas that place act on the individual and fewer that kind of look at like how the individual understands neighborhoods. So, one area that's kind of contradicts this is the study of residential preference and neighborhood selection, which emphasize how people judge and choose neighborhoods. But even these studies have really rarely leveraged data on the relational nature of neighborhoods. I think that this is because these studies rely on 3 types of data generally, none of which quite get after this idea. So on the one hand, you have studies that use residents' preference using really artificial or hypothetical neighborhoods. On another hand, you have studies that ask residents just about their own neighborhood, and so it doesn't put those neighborhoods into conversation. And then in the third case, we have some studies that use actual observations of how people move across neighborhoods and imply resident knowledge through those movements, but we never actually measure or capture resident knowledge, right? So we say, okay, so-and-so moved to neighborhood A, not neighborhood B, and that must be because they have a preference for neighborhood A, where they might not even know about neighborhood B. And so trying to understand that from this data is pretty hard. So one reason that this is the case, I think, in a lot of data is that some of these models are really still grounded in the rational actor framework, which implies that individuals have complete and accurate information about neighborhoods. We know this is a straw man. No one actually thinks that this is true, but the core ideas of this framework have really been incorporated into the study of neighborhood processes. So because we lack data or fail to incorporate these measures of neighborhood knowledge, our quantitative scholarship sort of implicitly implies this idea of perfect neighborhood knowledge. I do want to point out that there is a little bit of a shift recently, some led by my advisor, Elizabeth Brooke at the University of Michigan, which has tried to correct for this and has explicitly introduced the idea of limited neighborhood knowledge. But these are really in their early stages and they're very much the exception to sort of the rule generally. So the question largely remains, how can we measure neighborhood knowledge in a way that doesn't just capture what individuals know about their own neighborhoods or make assumptions about neighborhood knowledge, but instead captures this more relational and collective way that we think about neighborhoods. Right, so this complex sort of web of neighborhood understanding. All right, so I'm going to talk about a survey that I created. In my dissertation, I set out to do just what I was talking about, trying to create this relational measure by designing and fielding a survey to capture differences in local neighborhood knowledge among residents of Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And I want to acknowledge here that I'm drawing really heavily on the work of Maria Kreisen, Mike Bader, and Kyle Crowder, and then also on the work of Matthew Parmentier and Martin Van Ham from the University of Utrecht, who have done some similar work. And so the goal of this survey was to tap into residents' knowledge of and associations with neighborhood identity. Importantly, while some related research has relied just on how respondents see their own neighborhood, this survey was trying to capture residents' knowledge of their neighborhood and other neighborhoods across the city. So to that end, I developed a city-specific mapping tool, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, so that residents could both identify their neighborhood and other neighborhoods with which they were familiar. So this data was collected in 2018 because grad school is long via Qualtrics. And Qualtrics also helped by recruiting survey participants from their online research panel, using quotas for gender parity and city-specific quotas for respondent race and ethnicity. And I'll come back to this point really briefly, but I just want to say that I tried to get a representative of a sample as I could, but really the data are drawn from a non-probability sample. So just, be cautious with our interpretations as always. Right, so unlike typical data that is used in studies of neighborhood preference, these city-specific mapping tools aim to capture information about all the neighborhoods in a given city. And so to that end, I created these maps that have a discrete number of large identifiable neighborhoods with clearly delineated names. They were a little clearer on the survey tool itself. And boundaries and also spatial configurations that should be familiar to residents. To ensure that these maps highlighted collectively identifiable and meaningful neighborhoods, I drew on a variety of sources to try to validate this. I used municipal maps of neighborhood boundaries, so these should look very similar to the Chicago community areas. I also drew on other place mapping projects like the Mapping LA project hosted by the LA Times, and then on the maps used by amenity-based websites like Zillow, OpenTable, and Airbnb, figuring that if people are using those websites and sort of saying, I want to go to dinner in Bridgeport, that the map of Bridgeport that they're using and the map of Bridgeport that I'm using, you should have some face validity. So in total, these mapping tools included 83 neighborhoods in Los Angeles, which is just the city, not the county, 83 neighborhoods in Chicago, and then 72 neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. And so this setup of the survey tool basically asked respondents to use these maps to select their residential neighborhood, and then they answered a series of questions about that neighborhood. And then use the same mapping tool to select neighborhoods with which they were familiar. And you can see this sort of mock-up of what it looked like on a cell phone. The prompt said, using this clickable map, please select all the neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles with which you're familiar, i.e. that you have lived, worked, spent time in, or otherwise know about. And that last part is really key because I'm not just interested in places that residents know because they've spent time there, but I'm also interested in places that residents know just by reputation or because they've intentionally not spent time there. And so there's not very many other surveys that are trying to capture that same piece of information, that dimension of places I know, but only through sort of secondary or sort of social knowledge. And so I use this list of neighborhoods that respondents are familiar with to then try to further elucidate the relational structure of neighborhood schemas that people hold in their heads. I used a series of different tasks. So for example, I asked respondents to group neighborhoods by similarity. I didn't define what it meant for a neighborhood to be similar. And then I also asked residents to rank neighborhoods on desirability. And though I haven't actually had a chance to analyze this data. The goal of those tasks and the future work that I hope to glean from them is to really use the data to interrogate similarities that residents were drawing between places and try to back out from how people say, I'm thinking about these places as similar, what it is, what the neighborhood attributes, the location, the composition might be functioning to sort of influence how people are drawing connections between places. So basically, the tool is asking people to identify places that they know and then try to map how they think about those places in relation to one another without telling me, like, why do I think about this place as similar to somewhere else? Because I think of that as sort of my work, trying to back out those processes. So I like to think that there were certain advantages from this tool. One is that I used a 3-city sample, so it allows for some interesting cross-city comparisons to make sure that processes or patterns that I'm picking up in one place carry over to other places. Another is that I'm using these maps to look at identifiable neighborhoods rather than really large geographies like a city overall or hypothetical neighborhoods or sort of undefined local communities. And then I also can use these maps to link them with census data using the boundaries and also look at sort of consistent reference points between respondents. There are a couple of caveats, which are that in the survey and because of IRB data restrictions, I didn't collect residents' actual addresses. So I don't know, if someone told me I live in South Deering, I don't know if they live here or if they live right on the corner. And there are reasons why that might be relevant to various research questions. So I don't have that. And then the other thing is these are still pretty large geographies. There's lots of reasons to think that neighborhoods would be smaller or sort of individually defined. There's a huge debate in sociology about what is actually a neighborhood. And I think to have consistency with neighborhood identities, you kind of have to move, you just have to create a definition yourself. And so that I do that, but they create some large geographies. I mentioned just quickly about the representative nature of the data. Even though I didn't recruit through a representative sample, I think that the recruitment process actually yielded a fairly representative sample. There's a little bit of skew. For example, my respondents are more likely to be white and to own homes and to be new to their neighborhoods. But in future work, I'm going to adjust for these differences with survey weights. There's a lot of good scholarship that suggests that that should yield basically representative samples for each city. And then, so that was about the demographics, but if you want to think about the representativeness in terms of coverage across the city, which I did not build into my sampling plan. I didn't task Qualtrics with getting me people in each neighborhood. I still did pretty well. With a couple of exceptions, I basically have at least some respondents in almost every neighborhood that I created across the cities. So not only am I able to have respondents thinking about their own neighborhoods, but then they also think about and gave me responses about neighborhoods all throughout.
Is this more or less proportional to population size, or are there other?
It's not.
No.
I mean, it is, especially with that over sampling of white respondents, it ends up being a little bit more weighted, and you can see here it's a little bit more weighted to sort of the north side. But because the data is not only capturing what you know about your own neighborhood, but then also all these other neighborhoods, I had around 1,500 respondents, but I actually have around like 10,000 data points about people's perceptions of other neighborhoods.
A lot of people in Hyde Park.
Yeah, I had a professor in Hyde Park tell me there was an issue with my survey. He sent me an email saying, I think something's broken, which was great because I was able to fix it. But okay, so that was just an overview of the survey. So what can we do with this type of data? I'm going to share 2 projects with you that are trying to draw on this idea of sort of relational studies of neighborhoods. So the first is just a descriptive project that uses the data on neighborhood familiarity to try to replicate some research on neighborhood blind spots that Maria Kreisen and Mike Bader have worked on. And so the sort of core concept of this project is the idea that rather than assume that respondents are equally familiar with every neighborhood in an urban space, there might be differences in familiarity that are important to understanding how and why neighborhoods change over time. And that these racial differences in familiarity could also then contribute to persistent segregation. So basically the argument goes that if groups don't know about a neighborhood, they can't consider it in their residential choice. And so understanding how these blind spots function can help us understand a little bit more like what might be driving residential segregation. So I use my survey data, and then I also link it to some contextual data or I'll specifically talk about racial composition. I pulled in some other values as well. So the first piece of this question is just what proportion of neighborhoods do people actually know about, right? We're not omniscient, so how familiar are we with neighborhoods? And so perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, what I find is that respondents on average report being familiar with only a fraction of neighborhoods in a given city. Across all 3 cities, my respondents were familiar with about 1/5 of the neighborhoods. So for example, in Chicago, the average respondent selected 17% of neighborhoods, or about 14 of the 83 neighborhoods on the map. And that data also suggested that there was some racial variation in neighborhood familiarity. So in Chicago, white respondents selected significantly more neighborhoods that they were familiar with. In LA and DC, Black respondents actually selected significantly more neighborhoods than other racial groups. So, we get not only are people's familiarity somewhat limited, but they're also varied.
I know you mentioned this, but again, is familiarity more than just being aware that the neighborhood exists, or does it imply that they've been there?
Doesn't imply that they've been there. So it implies that they know that the neighborhood exists, but you would think if people were taking a very blasé approach to that question, they would just select every single neighborhood and be like, yeah, sure, I've heard of that place. I've heard of that place. The fact that people have more of a limited set, I think suggests that they're tapping into really that they know about a neighborhood. But yeah, it's not just that it exists, and it's not hyper familiarity with it.
These are just the responses to that first question.
It's just the responses to that first question. Yeah, Mark.
Maybe you're gonna talk about this, but I'm wondering, as people stay in the city longer, do they start knowing more neighborhood, or is it not that, but actually you kind of know what you know going in and kind of stay to your little familiar bubble?
That's a really good question. Because I was replicating this paper by Kreisen and Bader, which is really more about racial differences in what places people know. I didn't look, this is from a white paper from a couple of years ago, but I didn't look at that difference in length of tenure and neighborhood knowledge, but I can, and so I should. Yeah.
To piggyback to that point.
Mhm.
For Hispanic and Asian communities, they tend to have more immigrant households.
Mhm.
And so also curious if you saw anything there.
We'll get to part of that. Not quite touching on the immigration piece, but I'll get to some racial variation. Brian, did you have a question? Oh, no, you just involuntary arm movements. Okay. So not only did I find evidence that people only have partial knowledge of neighborhoods, but I also found that this knowledge varies geographically by the race of respondents. So let's look at Chicago. So if you examine what are thought of as group-based blind spots, you can calculate the percentage of white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian respondents that are familiar with each neighborhood in a given city, and then map those results. And so that's what these maps show, that there are distinctive patterns of neighborhood familiarity by racial group. So for example, in Chicago, looking at Black respondents, it's probably no surprise to the people in this room that Black respondents report higher familiarity with neighborhoods on the south side, while white and Hispanic respondents report greater familiarity with neighborhoods on the city's north and west sides. And so you can look at how this relates to actual demographic composition of these neighborhoods. So I'm not going to show the models here, but I used multi-level models to test the influence of race on neighborhood familiarity. And basically they confirm that racial composition in a neighborhood is a really strong predictor of if that neighborhood is known or not to that racial group. So for example, I find that for non-Black respondents, the percent of African Americans living in a neighborhood is negatively associated with a respondent's familiarity, and the same thing for Hispanic respondents. So as the proportion of Hispanic residents goes up, non-Hispanic knowledge of that neighborhood goes down.
Some of the central areas of the city are known to everybody.
Yeah, and these maps are better in print, but you can barely see. I highlighted the business district, really, just to try to kind of emphasize, like, here's a place that people might know more often because of work, and maybe has less to do with the racial composition. So you can see kind of a similar pattern playing out across Los Angeles, where Black respondents report greater familiarity with sort of South Central LA, whereas white respondents are a lot more familiar with like the northern, western side and San Fernando Valley. And then I also find very similar thing with a similar pattern with Washington D.C, where Black respondents are more familiar with Anacostia, whereas white respondents are much more familiar with sort of northwest quadrant of the city. And that also maps onto where those groups live. Right, so that was one project on neighborhood familiarity that, like I said, was trying to replicate this work by Kreisen and Bader, and I think offers some sort of proof of concept of how well the survey did, both that I was able to replicate their results. The results were relatively consistent across the 3 cities that I used. And yeah, sort of mapped on to racial composition within those neighborhoods. And so the last project that I'm going to talk about is my work on neighborhood reputation. And so in recent years, there's been this growing body of scholarship around neighborhood reputations, which I think were best defined by Japonica Brown-Saraceno and Jeff Parker, who was a PhD student at UChicago. They defined it as reputation as a collective understanding about a place based on stories people out in the world tell about it. So basically, the idea is that place reputations allow us to conjure in our heads an image of a neighborhood like Williamsburg in Brooklyn, Beverly Hills, the lower 9th Ward, and feel like we know something about that place without ever having been there. Moreover, reputation really helps us differentiate between desirable and undesirable places, and helps situate places in what I think of as the urban status hierarchy. So just in how sociologists have thought about reputation, research has landed on a few dimensions of reputation. First, like so many things, we've decided that reputation is socially constructed, meaning that reputations don't necessarily reflect objective aspects of a place. And also that reputations are not about a specific one attribute of a place, but really are an amalgamation of different dimensions. Second, scholars have argued that place reputations are basically the product of firsthand and secondhand knowledge, so insiders and outsiders. And then that reputations are understood to be relational, that they're defined through comparison. So all of this should hopefully trigger back to thinking about like Cooley, the looking glass self, Suttles' thoughts about neighborhoods and that contrastive position and having insiders and outsiders. So basically all of these aspects of reputation, I think, make them a really great candidate to think about reputation as an ecometric measure, or a concept that is better thought of as a trait of a place rather than as a trait of individuals. So ecometric measures were proposed by Steve Raudenbush, who's here at UChicago, and Rob Sampson, and basically study how neighborhood level or contextual variation captures the social ecological properties of a place. So basically, it's the study of the traits of places rather than the traits of individuals. And some other types of data that have been studied as ecometric are social cohesion, collective efficacy, disorder, dimensions that can't be defined by any one individual, but rather as collectively held assessments. And so the study of ecometrics tries to extend the techniques of psychometrics to neighborhoods by combining the responses of multiple respondents to compute an estimate of a neighborhood level construct. So in the case of this study, I'm using reputational assessments from a wide array of respondents, both people who live in a neighborhood and people outside of that neighborhood, to try to create a collective measure of reputation. And so the idea of this approach is to produce really a more relevant measure of local context and one that more accurately portrays the ecological conditions of a neighborhood. Raudenbush and Sampson use basically simple multi-level models to try to develop an estimate of ecometric properties. And really what we're most interested in is this, which ends up being a mean of the neighborhood reputation measure. So we have the reputations as stated by individuals, and then we have this mean measure of reputation that kind of comes out of that. And then we can break that down by other second level characteristics of neighborhoods, so like their composition and things like that. So in my paper that I'm working on neighborhood reputations, I'm using my survey data on resident and non-resident perceptions to try to test this idea of ecometric properties, to try to validate it, and then to try to understand the underlying dimensions of neighborhoods that give rise to these shared perceptions of reputation. So I'm answering 4 questions in my paper. I'm not going to have time to get to all of those today, so I'm just going to try to focus on this idea of these collective measures, and then possibly on what's undergirding them. Right, so I use my survey again. I use the question, how would you assess the reputation of neighborhood X? It's just a simple 4-point Likert scale, so there's a little bit of a limited range in terms of how much variation we can actually get. And I have about 6,500 neighborhood assessments that I'm drawing on, both internal to residents and then external. And then the second part of the paper is trying to look at like what dimensions of neighborhoods are giving rise to these reputations. And so I pull in data from the American Community Survey, and then also some data on the built environment from NANDA, the National Neighborhood Data Archive. So I use this data to look at the relative ratings of neighborhood reputation. So that's illustrated on this side, where you can see that Englewood has generally a negative reputation, Lincoln Park generally a positive reputation, probably not a huge surprise to people in this room. But I can also use the data to look at the degree of agreement amongst respondents. So this is illustrating places where there's a high degree of agreement among respondents, but Kenwood is kind of middling. And then a lot more dispersed perspective around Woodlawn. Some people are positive, other people think it's really negative. So it sort of comes out in the wash. Yeah.
When when respondents are deciding which neighborhoods to click, are they like clicking on the map, or are they like listening?
So they have this list of neighborhoods that they're familiar with, right? There's like 17 neighborhoods in Chicago. And then I randomly selected 5 out of that group for them to give this rating to. Yeah.
Because I'm wondering, because Kenwood and Woodlawn, for example, really close together, similar name, but like very different neighborhoods.
Mhm.
So how that might confuse respondents, but maybe that's what you want to capture, since it's reputation based.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I wonder if I would have found different results if they had that visual as they were answering the questions rather than just kind of drawing on memory.
Do you think perceptions of neighborhood boundaries are consistent across people, or do you think it varies a lot?
I think it varies a lot, But I also think that from a research perspective, you kind of have to draw boundaries somewhere. And that was part of the exercise that I was, so I think that like the boundaries that I use, they're much more relevant than a census tract. They're probably going to be more meaningful to people than a census tract. The fact that they're the community areas, people have probably seen that map before. But yeah, I think that there is definitely variation in how people actually view neighborhoods, and like, maybe this person lives in a part of Woodlawn that is, significantly worse than the people who live really highly, or maybe they live next to each other and they just have really different views. It's kind of hard to know.
Totally. And do they see the map before they answer these questions, like your map?
Yeah, so they started out seeing the map and they selected the neighborhoods that they were familiar with. And then based on those selections, like that part gets ported forward in the survey, and then they answer some specific questions.
They're at least primed to your like geography.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that I argue in the paper is like, I gave them the mental scheme, the map that they should be working from. They don't remember that, but we try.
This might be something you've already done or plan to do, but it'll also be interesting how distance of the residents to these neighborhoods influences how close they are to the mean response for that neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. I think that there are a lot of reasons why distance may or may not play a role. Like I might live really far from Gold Coast, but still like it's Gold Coast, it's the name kind of implies like it's a desirable place. But yeah, that is something that I'd like to do, is do a little bit more spatial analysis of this data. This is currently like fairly aspatial.
Residents are more positive about their own neighborhood?
Residents are more positive about their neighborhood across the board. Yeah, I'm not showing that. That's another part of the paper, is looking at like, do the same neighborhood characteristics influence the reputational assessments of residents and non-residents? Everyone likes their neighborhood a little bit more than people outside of it. And then the fourth question that I'm trying to answer is actually, how do dimensions of your neighborhood sort of shape how you see other neighborhoods, which I think is really interesting, but a little bit complicated for this talk. Yeah, Brian.
You say in your data you do have when residents are rating sort of the reputation, broadly speaking, or thinking about it, whether or not they have traveled and do have that, if they're in or out, when you're analyzing. If they've actually visited the neighborhood.
I don't know if they've actually visited the neighborhood. I know if they live there, and then I know if they're familiar with it. But I don't know. Some of this research came out of a project, an unfunded NIH grant that I was working on with Maria Kreisen, where they wanted to measure, like, tell me all of the neighborhoods you've ever worked in, tell me all of the neighborhoods you've ever gone to the doctor in, all these different ways and reasons why you might have gone to places. As a lowly grad student, I did not have the funding to have such an elaborate research design and questionnaire. And so, I only know familiarity. I don't actually know like specifically how people have or have not interacted with neighborhoods. Yeah, next project. So running out of time a little bit. But what I can say is that that's not a great table. So part of what this paper is trying to do is validate this idea of an ecometric approach. And so we usually use two measures to try to understand how good of an ecometric property an attribute of a place has. We use the interclass correlation and the reliability. And these get a little technical, and I probably don't have quite enough time to get into the nitty-gritty details, but basically what I find is that the estimated interclass correlation is 2.47, which means that around 25% of the variation in reputation is estimated to be between neighborhoods. And then the reliability of that measure is around 90%. So there is a lot of consensus that's happening around the measure of reputation. And these numbers are actually, 25% doesn't seem very high, but when you look at like Sampson and Raudenbusch's work, who are the harbingers of ecometric measures, their ICCs usually range from about 0.1 to 0.4. And so this is like, it's right in the range. It suggests that there are these sort of ecometric or these neighborhood level properties. And then this is actually a higher level of reliability than Roundbush and Sampson typically get. So, those are both positive signs that suggest that reputation is really an ecometric measure. And then just thinking about the second part of the paper, looks at different predictors of neighborhood reputation and tries to say, okay, like what dimensions of neighborhoods have various relative importance for neighborhood characteristic or for reputational assessments. And my findings, I think, are not super surprising, but what I find is like as the proportion of white residents increases, the perceptions of reputations also increase. So more positive reputation for whiter neighborhoods. I see a similar, or I see a decline in reputation as non-white populations rise. I look also at socioeconomic status and median home value, and I find that both of those are positive predictors of reputation. So as they go up, reputational assessments also go up. And then I'm working on trying to think about aspects of the built environment. So often there's this sort of tension, and my mentor is Emily Talent. She's all about the built environment. I'm all about the demographics of places. So bringing those together, there's this tension between when people are thinking about the reputation of place, are they thinking about the composition of that place in terms of who lives there? Or are they thinking about the built environment? So I was trying to tease these apart. So I created these measures of neighborhood amenities and disamenities. It's a little bit tea leaf reading to decide what an amenity is. Like we would often think from the literature that like liquor stores would be a disamenity, but Gold Coast has wine shops. And so hard to really tell, hard to create these measures, but they do kind of perform the way that I'm hoping, which is that neighborhood, as amenities in a neighborhood go up, so does reputation. As disamenities, which include like brownfields, increase, neighborhood reputation goes down. And then these are just regression coefficients, just kind of showing one, that everyone has a more positive association with their own neighborhood. But then that when you look at the socioeconomic dimensions of neighborhood versus these more built environment parts, if you combine them all into the same model, really the social dimensions of neighborhoods are the things that kind of win out in terms of being reflected in reputation. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap in like places that have disamenities and their demographics. So just something to think about.
And some of this hit on the reputation from minorities and immigrants, is that because most of the respondents are majority? So if you did the reputation of people of the same ethnicity or of minorities in general, would you find a different result? So it's a homophilic effect versus.
That's an interesting question. I don't know. What I do find is that you can see here that Black respondents actually rate neighborhood reputations higher across the board, which is kind of a surprising result. And I did look at a cross-level interaction between the race of the respondent and the race of the neighborhood, and that was not significant. So it doesn't look like there's this sort of preference for one's own neighborhood or sort of a effect in the opposite direction.
There also seems to be a lot of disagreement because the error bars are quite large, much larger than anything.
Yeah.
else. The effect is also-
Yeah, that's true. It's a good point. Okay, so I hope today that I've just given you a taste of my research and how I'm trying to use survey data to measure how people think about neighborhoods. In my time at Mansueto, I'm going to continue to draw on these ideas and what we can learn by thinking about neighborhood identity through this relational lens. And I'm excited to share all that work with you guys more later in the future. Thank you.
So as always, we have about 10 minutes, so give it a first.
Thanks so much, Lydia. This was really interesting. I'm wondering, in light of the research you're doing, how you think about questions related to gentrification. So I guess if someone were to come to you and say, Lydia, all that extra money that wasn't floating around during grad school, here it is to study gentrification, what kind of questions would you ask first in light of this research?
Yeah, so I have tried to include measures of gentrification into some of these studies. I looked in the white paper on neighborhood familiarity. I actually looked specifically at if gentrifying neighborhoods had greater familiarity. You might think that people who knew the neighborhood before it gentrified and people who kind of came into awareness of the neighborhood because it's gentrifying might increase how familiar people were. And I didn't find a significant result there in terms of increased familiarity. But I am really, really interested in gentrification because I think gentrifying neighborhoods, which is kind of a pejorative term, and everyone says their neighborhood is gentrifying, and then demographers say actually no place is gentrifying by some sort of technical definitions. But I think that gentrifying neighborhoods have this really interesting property where, for the most part, reputations are understood to be like very sticky, but gentrifying places seem to be places that have slippery reputations. And so trying to draw those out is something that I'm really interested in, but I haven't had enough time to do that. So I think I can actually answer some of those questions with the data that I have. And I'm really interested, going back to that task that I had respondents to where they grouped and ranked neighborhoods. I'm really interested to see if one of the groups might be neighborhoods that we would think of as gentrified. So yeah, stay tuned.
Sorry, Mike for first year Harris.
Yeah, it's nice to see you again.
So I was just curious, this is like purely anecdotal, but I've noticed when I talk to people who are more like college educated about like the space around them, they tend to talk about neighborhood level sort of units. But when I talk to people from like immigrants or perhaps like a lower education level, they tend to talk about space in terms of streets, like main streets. They tend to be really important, and they can tell you exactly where they are, like at the street level. And that seems to be really important, and how they relate to the environment around them. So I was just curious if that's something you're considering, or if that's something that came up as a possible way to kind of get at some communities that might not be as responsive to, let's say, the neighborhood that's.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have a couple of sort of immediate reactions to that. One is I'm coming from working in Detroit, where the concept of neighborhood almost has no meaning and everyone just talks about streets. And they'll tell you like which side of Gratiot they live on, which side of Woodward they live on, but they won't really use neighborhood terms. And I always assumed that that was really oriented towards car culture, that the city is like so dependent on cars that they just think about streets. But I actually think, what you're talking about the like lower level education respondents maybe being more street oriented, also has to do with like transit and how they're getting around. That they're not necessarily, that they're probably more reliant on like buses. And so like understanding the street grid has a lot more meaning. It also makes me think of Stephanie DeLuca's work, where she's one of the people who's kind of pushing back on this idea of like the rational actor framework and the idea that people know all places. But one of the things that she also has studied is this idea that like, especially among low income and mostly renters, like they know this part of the neighborhood versus this part of the neighborhood is good. It's good versus bad. And so she is often talking about like people's perceptions are really micro level, especially when you don't have the income to choose out of a low income or less desirable neighborhood, that you start to sort of pick up on pockets of less desirable neighborhoods that are still more desirable, and that gets really, really fine grained. It's like this block, not that block. So that's very similar to what you're talking about. I would suggest, yeah, taking a look at some of her work, and I'm happy to send you a couple of citations that would talk about that. Yeah, Brian.
Thought about how. And I feel like we did, I'm just talk more about it, about how mobility itself factors into this, because a lot of, these are sort of anecdotally again, but kind of higher economic areas probably have more mobility choices, access to cars or car ownership, and then the range of things, I mean, all sorts of different kinds of people, et cetera, versus some of the less service neighborhoods where you might only have access to bus or bus entry, but like there's a lot there that speaks to one, it's an amenity, but also in terms of reputation and how people even are able to perceive other neighborhoods based on their ability to physically travel to them.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I talked about trying to create these measures of neighborhood amenities and disamenities, and I'm using principal component analysis to try to back out sort of how various variables hang together. And I didn't include transit, but I don't know if folks are very familiar with NANDA's data, but they have really amazing data that they have mapped onto census tracts primarily. They also create measures of socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. And then they also look at that data over time. So they're a great resource. And I think that they do have transit data, but I haven't included it here. I think it's a little hard to, in this oversimplified amenity versus disamenity, it's kind of hard to know like where does transit land. I think in some places it's an amenity, in other places it's kind of a disamenity. So yeah, I have it, but that could be interesting. I could throw it into my PCA and see if my PCA kicks it back out. Yeah.
There's also, I think, behind transit and also like, how they perceive their own neighborhood. There's also the question of like, how does their understanding of neighborhoods form through their access to those, whether it's in-person experience and stuff. And I do think you could tease some of this out from your data with, linking it to transit. Because I'm sure that these reputations are forming very differently through the news and television news and stuff than do.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And going back to your idea about like the spatial nature and doing the spatial analysis, thinking about like the blue line and how it runs versus other lines in the city, like you can not only do a spatial analysis of like proximity, but also like, sort of being on the same transit line.
Do you have outcome variables, not outcome, but like beyond prestige or the main observable that you have? Do you have things like your perception of crime in that neighborhood or safety or something like that?
Yeah, the only thing that I have is your perception of the racial composition of your own neighborhood. This is going back to like having slightly limited space in the survey, but that's something I'm really interested in. And some of my other work in Michigan has looked at perceptions of crime, but again, that's only in one's own neighborhood. I think it would be really interesting to think about perceptions of crime in other places. Just adds, once you start getting like asking questions about specific dimensions of place, it just gets a little bit more complex. And yeah, so I am still thinking about like, how would I actually do that?
One more question?
Yeah, one question I had, sorry, this is the earlier part of your presentation. For amenities, do you use like establishment level data at all? Like physical sites or locations or specific services or
Yeah.
Okay, got it. So use like, what was the data source for that?
So it was the National Neighborhood Data Archive, and they have measures of I think when I created amenities, I used like museums, cultural sites, art, like art galleries, things that are like very hoity-toity, to be honest, because I'd like to use things like restaurants,
Yeah.
but you might have a huge concentration of like McDonald's and Wendy's that sort of offset the nicer, more upscale. So yeah, again, like the PCA for neighborhood amenities and disamenities, kind of messy, not my favorite thing. But I'm just trying to sort of back out in general, like, are there indicators of sort of what we think of as like nice parts of the built environment and then less nice parts of the built environment?
Got it. Because if you did want to go down that path of incorporating cafes and restaurants and potentially disaggregating the signature of a McDonald's versus like some bougie restaurant. There is a data set available on campus through the library from Info USA.
Okay, yeah.
And they take basically like on the Brad Street establishment level data set, with the like 6-digit NAICS codes at the establishment level. And there is like sufficient detail within the NAICS code to differentiate fast food counter serve from like brick and mortar fine dining. And so like something like that here, and it's all that.
Yeah.
That's one thing to look consider. It's a lot of data to look at.
Yeah, I think it's like is the juice worth the squeeze?
Exactly, right.
It's always a question, but
Sometimes you don't know.
often.
All right, so Lydia's here, so, don't be strangers. Thank you, Lydia, for your talk, especially feeling a little sick.
Yeah.
And please don't be shy, come and talk to Lydia.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you.
you.